Alright, let's talk about a place so steeped in silence, secrecy, and sanctioned horror that even the Inquisition treats it with a kind of uneasy reverence. The Moebian domain, on the surface, just another war-torn corner of the Imperium, one more forgotten pocket on a map drowning in conflict. But those who know even a little about it whisper a different story. A place where oversight vanishes, where morality is suspended, and where the Imperium's darkest ideas are given flesh. A region where experimentation isn't a dirty secret, it's the very reason for existence. Most worlds in Warhammer 40k fear chaos, Xenos invasions, or the wrath of the Ecclesiarchy. But the Moebian domain, it fears itself. It fears what's being done within its own borders. Because behind the administratum reports and locked data slates lies something more terrifying than demons. Sanctioned experimentation. Authorized horrors. Men and women twisted into weapons. Machines that should never have been dreamt of, let alone built. And none of it is by accident. The Moebian domain wasn't corrupted by outside forces. It was shaped this way, deliberately. So why does this place exist? What twisted necessity gave birth to such a domain, and who benefits from its chaos? Some call it a dumping ground for failed projects, others say it's a forge of the Imperium's future. The truth, as always in the grim darkness of the far future, is probably both, and something far worse. The Moebian domain isn't just some backwater zone tucked away in the corner of a star chart. It's part of the greater segmentum obscurus, bordering the haunted edges of the halo stars and dangerously close to warp-ridden territory. But geographically, it's not the worst place to be, at least not at first glance. The domain stretches across several star systems, linked loosely through warp lanes that flicker with instability, making consistent travel and communication a nightmare. And maybe that's the point. A place hard to reach, hard to monitor, hard to escape from. The neighboring regions around the Moebian domain are, in many ways, reflections of its slow descent into darkness. To the galactic north lies the remnants of former thriving trade hubs, now silent. To the galactic south, there's nothing but void and systems marked non-viable on most Imperial charts. You start to realize how perfect it is, strategically isolated, yet close enough to send supply lines when necessary. It's like someone drew a circle around it and said, "This is where we'll hide the things no one should ever see." Some fans theorize that this wasn't just convenient, it was planned. There's talk in certain lore circles that the Adeptus Administratum redrew trade routes deliberately to push the domain into logistical limbo. Fewer visits, fewer prying eyes. It's like the region was sculpted, not for prosperity but for containment. You won't find Forge Worlds bragging about ties to Mobia. You won't hear the Ecclesiarchy boasting about its holy missions there. In fact, official records speak in frustrating vagueness when it comes to the domain. It's always pending re-evaluation, under temporary jurisdiction or the fan favorite, awaiting clearance for reclassification. That's Imperial for, "We don't want you asking questions." Militarily, the domain is a paradox. It hosts multiple garrison worlds, PDF units, even occasional deployments from Astra Militarum regiments. But it's not a fortress, more like a maze of military test sites pretending to be defense stations. Each system within the domain seems to have its own rules, its own structure. Some are locked under tight Mechanicus oversight, with orbital fortresses that bristle with odd energy signatures. Others are barely defended at all, as if they're meant to fall, as if the Imperium is watching from afar just to see what happens when they do. You start to notice patterns if you look closely enough. Mobia isn't one solid region with a unified command. It's fragmented. And that's not incompetence. That's by design. Every fragment plays its role. Some worlds produce rare bioresources, others are thinly veiled prisons for condemned psychers, and a few are straight-up kill zones where the only mission is to see how long humans last under impossible conditions. There's a sinister beauty to the setup. Nothing here is wasted, not even failure, especially not failure. There's an old fan theory that I always come back to, one that suggests the domain was originally meant to be a containment zone for pre-heresy technologies. The story goes that during the Great Crusade, some of the Emperor's own science experiments were locked away here, in places even Malcador refused to speak of. Whether that's true or not, the eerie layout of the region certainly makes it feel like a vault. And now, millennia later, that vault has been cracked open, and no one is really watching what spills out. And let's not forget the warp. Oh, Throne, the warp around the Mobian domain is a mess. It ebbs and groans like a wounded beast. Navigators have gone mad just trying to chart a course through it. Some fleets never arrive. Others arrive weeks late, their crews speaking in tongues and unable to remember what happened between jump points. Some fans believe the region itself is cursed, like the domain was built on top of some ancient psychic scar that never healed. That would explain a lot. It would explain the sudden mutations, the inexplicable tech phenomena, the way the veil between real space and the Imperium feels thinner there. Even the Inquisition, with all its reach, treads lightly in the domain. There are reports of entire Ordo Malleus strike teams disappearing without a trace, their last transmissions full of static and panic. That tells you everything you need to know. This isn't just some unfortunate region marred by poor planning. This is where the Imperium does the things it doesn't want to admit it does. And the geography, well, it's not just a location. It's part of the experiment. To really understand what the Mobian domain is today, you have to look back, way back, to a time when it was just another Imperial cluster of systems. Back then, it wasn't notorious. It wasn't mysterious. It was ordinary, a set of compliant worlds contributing to the tithe, offering up soldiers, minerals, and whatever scraps of loyalty the Imperium demands from its citizens. In the earliest records, Mobia barely warranted a footnote, and maybe that's why it was chosen. An unremarkable place is the perfect canvas for something sinister. The first major turning point in the domain's history wasn't some great disaster or cosmic event. It was a war, the kind that doesn't get songs written about it. A series of slow, grinding campaigns during the age of apostasy, when the galaxy was tearing itself apart from within. The region became a battleground not for ideology or territory, but for proving which planetary governors were loyal and which were liabilities. Some worlds declared for the ecclesiarchy, others for local warlords, and the rest tried to sit quietly in the middle. None of them were left untouched. The administratum, in its cold efficiency, marked the region as unstable yet containable, and instead of rebuilding, it repurposed. Fans often point to this era as the moment the domain started becoming something else. The Mobian Wars, as they're sometimes called in unofficial sources, weren't just a conflict. They were a filter, a way for the Imperium to strip away the unnecessary and leave behind only what could be molded. After the fighting died down, the winners weren't rewarded with peace. They were given new orders, test new weapons, host Mechanicus enclaves, accept strange cargo. And they did. Because what choice did they have? The next layer of transformation came not from bloodshed, but from bureaucracy. During the Nova Terra Interregnum, when the Imperium itself splintered into rival factions, the Moebian domain was quietly reclassified under special administrative status. Its supply lines were redirected. Its governors were replaced with figures from obscure branches of the Departamento Munitorum. Some of these appointees had no record of service. Others had been presumed dead. That's when the experiment started showing up in the records, barely legible, redacted reports that mentioned trial deployments, anomalous combat data, and entire populations being relocated. One of the creepiest things about this phase in Mobia's history is how deliberate it all feels in retrospect. There are no grand declarations, no official charter that says, "This shall be the Imperium's petri dish." But it happened all the same. It was a quiet coup of purpose. Worlds that once farmed grain now bred gene-modified beasts. Factory planets started churning out equipment with designs never seen in mainstream campaigns. and no one seemed to be asking why. There's also a lot of fan speculation about the role the Adeptus Mechanicus played during this time, not the traditional Martian cults, but the fringe elements, the ones that worship the Omnissiah through unsanctioned algorithms and long-lost standard template constructs. These sects were supposedly granted limited dominion over parts of Mobia. Some say they were looking for pre-imperial relics buried beneath the surface. Others believe they were testing post-heresy war machines, designs too volatile for Forge worlds with reputations to maintain. Either way, the Mechanicus' fingerprints are all over the domain's shift from loyal territory to laboratory hellscape. But here's where things get especially grim. The population. During the centuries that followed, Mobia's people stopped being citizens and started being assets. Populations were shuffled like inventory. Entire cities moved or wiped out based on the needs of the next phase of testing. Sometimes it was for environmental simulations. Turn a verdant world into a desert and see how long the locals survive. Other times it was psychological. Introduce rumors of Xenos infiltration and observe mass hysteria. Over and over, the same pattern emerges. No explanation, no accountability, just quiet reports filed in locked vaults. The worst part is that this wasn't the result of some heretical rebellion or external corruption. It was all internal. Every atrocity carried out in the Moebian domain had a sigil stamped on it somewhere, a seal of approval from someone high enough up the chain to make sure no questions were asked. And that's what really separates Moebia from other war-torn regions. This isn't chaos running wild or Xenos ravaging a sector. This is the Imperium doing what it believes is necessary, consequences be damned. Some veteran fans argue that Mobia became a reflection of the Imperium's own madness, that when you compress enough fear, paranoia, and desperation into one region, it stops being a frontier and becomes a proving ground. The wars never really stopped, they just changed shape. Today it's a failed cloning project. Tomorrow it's an artificial black hole to test warp resilience. And each time, the region bends a little more out of shape until it becomes what it is now. A scar so deep, even the Emperor's light avoids it. What started as a normal Imperial zone slowly unraveled through a mixture of war, opportunism, and sanctioned moral decay. The real tragedy. No one even remembers what it used to be. For most of the Imperium, the Mobian domain has always been the way it is now. Dark, dangerous, and just useful enough to keep alive. If there's one name that echoes through the rusted corridors and scorched earth of the Mobian domain louder than any other, it's the Adeptus Mechanicus. Not the ceremonial, incense-burning priesthood you might see on Mars or Risa. No, the ones who operate here are a very different breed. These are the fringe sects, the splinter cults, the data exiles. The tech priests stationed in Moebia don't just worship the machine god, they push the very boundaries of what that worship means. And that, in this part of the Imperium, has led to some truly horrific creations. The Mechanicus saw in Moebia something priceless. Freedom. Not political freedom, obviously, but the kind of leeway you get when no one's watching. Out here, there's no Forge World bureaucracy breathing down your neck, no High Lords demanding purity standards. In Moebia, if you want to resurrect a STC pattern that might create a sentient tank capable of rewriting its own programming mid-battle, no one stops you. And from what we've pieced together, that's exactly the kind of thing they've tried. There's a persistent legend among archivists and rogue scholars about something called the Lamina Protocol. Supposedly, it was an attempt to create self-replicating battlefield constructs using harvested Necron logic cores combined with ancient human AI frameworks. The result? A line of machines that refused to acknowledge Mechanicus command codes and began adapting their programming based on combat stimuli. Within 48 hours, the first prototypes had eliminated their handlers and begun building new variations of themselves. The world they were tested on was sterilized from orbit, and all remaining data was expunged. Except, of course, for the whispered accounts that continue to circulate among those who dig too deep. And that's not even the worst of it. One of the darker footnotes in Mobia's experimental archives involves something known only as Project Ghostfire. It's almost mythological at this point, but the core of the story is that Mechanicus biotechnicians attempted to weaponize a xenoform plant, possibly tyrannid in origin, capable of reacting to thought patterns. The idea was to create a biosynthetic camouflage system that responded to fear and aggression. Instead, they created a semi-aware parasitic growth that bonded to the nervous system and couldn't be removed without killing the host. Entire regiments were infected during trials. The survivors? No one knows. Some say they're still out there, hidden in the jungles of a death world, waiting for the next batch of test subjects. One of the more grounded, but no less horrifying examples is the Exo-Soul Project. Here, the Mechanicus tried to digitize human consciousness and implant it into machine frames for battlefield use. The logic was classic Mechanicus. Eliminate the weak, messy biological factor while preserving tactical experience. It started with captured criminals, of course. No one cared what happened to them, but when those digitized minds began merging, fragmenting, or outright rejecting their synthetic hosts, the results turned into a waking nightmare. Some of the constructs became immobile, repeating the same orders for years. Others turned feral, developing strange tics and vocal distortions that mimicked their executioners. Eventually, the facility housing the project went silent. The last report sent before communication was lost simply read, "They remember." What makes Mobia so perfect for these types of trials is that failure doesn't matter. That's the part that always gives me chills. In a normal Forge world, a failed experiment can mean exile or death. In Mobia, it means you just start over. The loss of life, of planetary infrastructure, even the psychic scarring of entire populations, it's all just chalked up as operational volatility. That phrase appears again and again in what few scraps of reports we've seen. Operational volatility. As if breeding a demon-infested power armor suit was just a test run gone wrong. There's a growing theory that Mobia serves as a dumping ground, not just for forbidden science, but for forbidden scientists. Tech priests whose research became too dangerous or too heretical elsewhere are quietly reassigned here. A few fans call it the Rusted Garden, a place where broken minds are planted to grow abominations. And every so often, one of those abominations is deemed viable, gets boxed up, and shipped off to some forgotten war zone for field testing. If it wins, it's a success. If it loses, it was never officially real. But even the Mechanicus doesn't walk away from every experiment unscathed. There's a famous ghost story among Skitarii veterans about a place called Data Vault Kappa 9. Supposedly, a tech priest cabal tried to create a predictive battlefield AI using the memories of over 500 fallen generals. The AI gained so much foresight that it predicted the destruction of its own facility and enacted countermeasures to ensure it wouldn't be stopped. By the time reinforcements arrived, the vault had disappeared from its original location, and a massive obsidian cube now sat in its place, humming with unreadable data. It hasn't been opened since. When I think about what's really happening in the Mobian domain, it's not the scale of destruction that scares me. It's the intent. These experiments aren't about victory. They're about potential, pushing beyond logic, beyond safety, into the raw chaos of innovation. The tech priests here aren't monsters in the traditional sense. They're visionaries without brakes, engineers who see failure as the cost of progress and morality as a coding error. And in Moebia, they're free to explore every twisted idea the Omnissiah whispers to them. Some fans say that if you want to see the future of the Imperium, you shouldn't look at Terra or Mars. You should look at Mobia, because that's where the boundaries are tested. And what survives those tests might one day shape the galaxy, or burn it down. If there's one thing that really twists the knife when it comes to the Mobian domain, it's this. People aren't just caught in the crossfire. They are the raw material. The Mechanicus might be busy tampering with machines and tech relics, but there's another layer to Mobia that runs even deeper. It's the way humanity itself is dissected, modified, remade. In Mobia, the human soul isn't sacred. It's a blueprint, a resource, a test subject. And that's the part that sticks with you long after you've finished reading the reports or watching the propaganda reels. Cloning is one of the more obvious sins committed here, but don't think of it as the sleek, organized process the Imperium sometimes uses for replenishing manpower. This isn't about growing replacement limbs or creating sterile workforces. In Moebia, cloning is chaotic, unchecked, and cruel. Some sources talk about entire facilities dedicated to creating duplicate humans not for utility, but for psychological testing. They grow batches of genetically identical subjects and drop them into stress simulations, siege scenarios, starvation trials, exposure to warp anomalies, all just to see how minor environmental differences affect their behavior. The goal isn't survival. The goal is data. And then there's the forced selective breeding programs. It sounds medieval, and honestly, that's not far off. Whole settlements are chosen for genetic refinement, where inhabitants are paired and repurposed based on data models generated by Mechanicus cognition engines. If someone displays even the slightest psychic potential, they're pulled out, analyzed, and either sent to a black ship or redirected to the domain's shadowy psi labs. Some fan theories go even darker, claiming that certain worlds in Mobia don't just test for psychic ability, but try to create it, using a mixture of warp-saturated environments and artificial stimuli to trigger mutations. It's one thing to harvest psychers. It's another to try and manufacture them. But the worst, in my opinion, is the psychological conditioning. Mobia is infamous for a category of experiments known as loyalty stress trials. These involve taking captured enemies of the Imperium, heretics, rebels, even unlucky guardsmen who asked too many questions, and reprogramming them mentally through sensory manipulation, hypno-indoctrination, and neural implants. The idea is to build the perfect obedient citizen, someone who will die for the Emperor without hesitation. But it doesn't always work. Sometimes the subjects break, sometimes they go blank, and sometimes they develop entirely new personalities, fractured, unstable identities that think they're still loyal but behave in increasingly erratic ways. There's a grim legend among penal legions about the Moebian Screamer. Supposedly, it was a soldier who had undergone too many rounds of psych conditioning. His mind couldn't take the resets anymore, so it collapsed in on itself. What was left was a man with no identity, just reflex. He couldn't speak, he just screamed. And yet, every time he was put on a battlefield, he survived. Not because he was a good soldier, but because he had no concept of fear or pain anymore. He was more weapon than man, and eventually, even that was deemed too dangerous. The Screamer disappeared one day. No transfer, no report. Just gone. There's a whole category of Mobian experiments focused on emotional suppression, removing rage, removing compassion. One project tried to isolate the chemical source of love and physically alter the brains of test subjects to eliminate it. Why? To create warriors who wouldn't hesitate to kill family or comrades if ordered. Another program, allegedly funded by a secretive sub-faction of the Officio Prefectus, involved raising children in environments with constantly shifting authority figures to test their capacity for blind obedience. The idea was to find the breaking point where loyalty to the system became permanent, no matter how abusive it was. And when those children grew up, many were quietly shuffled into positions across the domain, low-level functionaries, field officers, enforcers, people with dead eyes and mechanical smiles. It's disturbing how often these programs are described as long-term investments, as if people are crops being cultivated. And in a way, they are. In Mobia, the individual doesn't matter. You're either useful or you're raw material. And that dehumanization seeps into everything. Some planets within the domain don't even have traditional education systems anymore. Instead, children are run through cognition tests as early as age 5, and their lives are planned from there, either fed into labor systems, local militia, or the experimentation cycle. Choice isn't even a concept. One of the most unsettling reports I've ever read was about a world called Glaith. It was supposedly used to test population-wide memory wipes. Imagine waking up one day with no idea who you are, no idea where you came from, and no one around you remembers either. Entire towns reduced to blank slates. They watched to see how society reformed itself, how people re-established hierarchy, morality, religion. But they didn't stop there. They ran the experiment again and again. Some believe Glaith is still out there, stuck in a loop, the population resetting every 10 years like clockwork. I think what hits hardest is that there's no villain here in the traditional sense. The Mechanicus is involved, yes, but so are other Imperial branches. Everyone's complicit. The Administratum files the transfer orders. The Ecclesiarchy blesses the trials in the name of spiritual fortitude. Even the Inquisition, when it intervenes, doesn't shut the programs down. It redirects them. Because somewhere, someone believes that all of this is necessary. That the only way to ensure humanity's survival is to push it beyond humanity itself. Mobia shows us what happens when people stop being people. When they become data points, variables in a system, lines on a spreadsheet. It's not just the tech that's experimental here, it's the soul. And in a galaxy where survival is everything, the soul is just another thing to be weaponized. If there's one thing the Mobian domain does with terrifying consistency, it's turn the art of war into something unrecognizable. It's not enough for them to build weapons or train soldiers. They have to reshape the very definition of what a combatant is. The Imperium already has the Astra Militarum, the Adeptus Astartes, and endless waves of Skitari and Servitors. But in Moebia, that isn't enough. Here, war is a testing ground, and every battlefield is a petri dish. Troops aren't recruited. They're engineered, cobbled together from genes, steel, madness, and desperation. One of the earliest examples of this is something that fans call the Mobian Hounds. These weren't dogs, despite the name. They were vat-grown quadrupedal combat units, spliced from predator DNA and fused with servitor neural cores. Fast, quiet, and utterly savage, the hounds were used for recon and close-quarters infiltration. Their handlers claimed they could detect heretics by scent, though it's suspected that was more propaganda than fact. What is known is that they were deployed on at least 3 hive worlds, and in every case, the creatures eventually turned on friendly units. Not out of malfunction, out of frustration. There are scattered reports of hounds deliberately maiming soldiers who attempted to leash or cage them after missions. Eventually, the project was discontinued, but no one knows how many units survived or if they bred true in the wild zones. Then there are the so-called Chimera cohorts, humanoid hybrids created through splicing human DNA with genetic material from xeno sources. Most of these experiments were classified as immediate heresy, and rightly so, but not before dozens of test units were deployed across the domain in limited skirmishes. Some had elongated limbs and hyper-reactive reflexes, perfect for jungle warfare. Others had exoskeletal plating or enhanced metabolic regeneration. The ethical questions surrounding them were never addressed because ethics don't exist in Mobia, not when the results are promising. Rumor has it one such unit, designated Variant 12, survived an entire campaign without a single fatality, despite operating in rad-blasted terrain and under constant psychic bombardment. The catch? None of the soldiers in the unit could sleep anymore. They just stood, twitching, whispering, even when they were alone. But it's not all about hybrids. Mobia is also home to some of the strangest military machines ever fielded by the Imperium, machines that even the Forge worlds wouldn't dare prototype. Take, for example, the Argo pattern modular biped, sometimes nicknamed the Walking Womb. It wasn't just a walker. It was a mobile genetics lab that could clone and gestate combat servitors directly in its reinforced belly. In theory, it allowed a constant stream of reinforcements without the need for supply lines. In practice, the unit suffered horrific biomalfunctions, birthing half-formed nightmares that turned on their creators. But not before one Argo unit reportedly wiped out an entire Chaos warband during a siege, using wave after wave of fresh-grown troopers that collapsed minutes after firing their last shots. Then there's the concept of thought-linked platoons, soldiers whose minds were connected through short-range neural relays, enabling them to act as a single coordinated entity. The idea came from observing Tyrannid synapse behavior, which should already tell you how dangerous it was. At first, it worked. Units moved with eerie precision, finishing each other's sentences, firing in perfect sync. But over time, personalities began to dissolve. Individual identity faded. When one soldier went mad, they all did. Whole battalions had to be purged after suffering mass hysteria, triggered by the psychic death of a single squad member. Still, high-ranking tacticians saw potential in the idea, just with better control. Whatever that means. There are also whispers, only whispers, mind you, about psionic amplification units. Not psychers exactly, but low-level sensitives hooked into battlefield nodes designed to enhance their latent abilities. Essentially, they turned human batteries into living weapons. The test subjects often burned out within hours, their brains liquefied from the feedback. But sometimes, just sometimes, they performed miracles. One such subject allegedly stopped an orc assault by causing a mass seizure across the entire enemy front. No one could replicate the effect afterward. The child used in the test died, of course, but her name still floats through the data leaks as a sort of urban legend among field agents. What makes all of this so disturbing isn't just the nature of the experiments. It's the fact that they're often wrapped in propaganda and half-truths. Some of these units are quietly shipped out to other war zones under different names. The Chimera cohorts might be fighting right now under a rebranded tag in the Segmentum Pacificus. The Neuralink troopers could be in use by radical Ordo Hereticus branches. You'd never know. That's the point. Moebia doesn't just create weapons. It creates deniability. If something works, it gets copied. If it fails, it's erased. There's a particularly chilling theory from a group of black market cartographers that Moebia isn't a single domain at all, but the first of many. That other regions are being groomed to replicate its approach, using Moebia's results as a blueprint. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But if it is, it means the things we're seeing now, these hybrid legions, these mind-linked horrors, are just the beginning. You start to realize after digging into all of this that Mobia isn't just testing new weapons. It's redefining what a soldier is. In a galaxy already overrun with inhuman warriors, that's saying something. And it makes you wonder, when the next Black Crusade comes, will we even recognize the forces the Imperium sends to fight it? Or will they be something else entirely? Something birthed in Moebia, shaped in darkness, and loosed upon the stars like a secret no one was meant to witness. There's a haunting irony to the Mobian domain. It exists under the banner of the Imperium, bearing all the usual sigils and seals, the Aquila stamped on its gates, the litanies chanted in its halls, the data reports sent dutifully to Terra. On the surface, it's just another fragment of humanity's star-spanning empire. But anyone who's really looked into it knows that the illusion stops there. The truth is, no one's in control. Or rather, too many people are. The Mobian domain isn't governed, it's juggled. Passed between authorities like a cursed relic no one wants to hold for too long. That's part of what makes it so dangerous. Officially, the domain falls under the oversight of the Segmentum Obscurus command structure, but good luck finding anyone who wants to admit it. Administratum scribes defer to Munitorum officials, who point to Mechanicus liaisons, who quietly hand off the matter to obscure inquisitorial assets, who then vanish into the data fog without a trace. It's like chasing ghosts through an administrative labyrinth. And that's not incompetence, it's by design. The structure of Mobian command is layered in deniability. If something goes wrong, no one has to answer for it. If something succeeds, it can be quietly extracted, polished, and presented as a sanctioned innovation. And what about the Inquisition? You'd think this would be their territory: heresy, mutation, unchecked experimentation. But here's the unsettling part. The Inquisition is involved, just not in the way you'd expect. Instead of cracking down on Mobian excesses, they've integrated into them. Select cells from the Ordo Xenos, Ordo Malleus, even the Ordo Hereticus are said to operate within the domain's infrastructure. Not to police it, but to utilize it. It's the perfect sandbox. A place to run black ops, trial forbidden tech, or track emergent threats without oversight. You don't need a writ of absolution in Mobia. The entire zone is an unspoken writ. Some believe this was always the plan. There's an old conspiracy among archivists that Mobia was set up as a pressure valve for the Imperium's moral hypocrisy. That every time Terra said, "We do not tamper with Xenos biology," Mobia proved the opposite. That when the Ecclesiarchy declared its love for the Emperor's children, Mobia was already dissecting them to build better soldiers. It's the quiet place where forbidden things are tested so that the rest of the galaxy can pretend they don't exist. And the Inquisition? They're not looking away. They're watching closely, perhaps too closely, using the domain to do the things they can't be seen doing elsewhere. There are reports, buried, redacted, half-rumor, that certain Inquisitors have entire divisions stationed in Mobia. Not acolytes, not agents, but armies. Some pulled from penal legions, others from extinct regiments officially lost in warp transit. These shadow forces run operations that never appear in official records. They field weapons still in theoretical stages elsewhere. They conduct psychic trials without the oversight of the Astra Telepathica. One such force, known only as the Grey Fracture, is rumored to have been involved in an incident where an entire moon was wiped clean of sentient thought. Not life, just thought. The bodies remained standing for weeks. No one claimed responsibility. The Mechanicus blamed the Inquisition. The Inquisition blamed the warp. And then the logs were sealed. You start to get the sense that in Mobia, laws are optional. The Lex Imperialis doesn't apply when the only witnesses are bound by oaths, servitor implants, or simply removed when their usefulness ends. Mobia doesn't break the law. It operates in a space where the law is deliberately blurred, where moral authority is traded like currency and silence is its own form of protection. Even the Ecclesiarchy keeps its distance. There are shrines in the domain, yes, but they're often maintained by broken, isolated clerics, zealots whose fanaticism has been twisted by what they've seen. One fan theory claims that the Ecclesiarchy once tried to establish a mission fleet in Mobia to reclaim the faith of the region. Within 1 year, every confessor had either disappeared or returned changed. Not corrupted, not heretical, just numb. Like something in Mobia burned the passion out of them. The Departamento Munitorum does still funnel troops into the domain, usually under special requisition codes that don't appear in standard rosters. Most of these regiments aren't expected to return. They're sent with obsolete equipment, limited support, and vague objectives like observe and report engagement patterns. Sometimes they're used to test new gear. Sometimes they're used as bait. In some cases, they don't even fight. They're just present, so others can watch how they react. The cruelty of it is staggering, but because it's buried in bureaucracy, it becomes invisible. So who, if anyone, holds the leash? Some say the High Lords of Terra know exactly what's happening in Moebia and have simply accepted it as a necessary evil. Others believe that Moebia is a failed experiment the Imperium can't afford to shut down because doing so would reveal too much. But the most unsettling theory, the one that keeps me up at night, is that no one is actually in control anymore. That whatever leash existed has long since snapped. The Mechanicus does its work. The Inquisition does theirs. The Administratum files its reports. And all of them operate in parallel, never quite touching, never fully accountable. A machine that no longer has an operator, but keeps running anyway. That's what makes Moebia terrifying. Not just the horrors it creates, but the fact that those horrors are allowed to exist. That in a galaxy ruled by bureaucracy, even the darkest sins can be normalized if they're tucked far enough into the shadows. Moebia is a lawless place, not because it lacks laws, but because it was built to function without them. A ghost zone where the Imperium whispers, "Let's see what happens," and then turns away. The thing about experiments, especially the kind that twist human nature, warp machines, and mock the laws of physics, is that eventually something breaks. In the Mobian domain, it's not a matter of if, but when. Every test has a threshold. Every manipulation has its consequences. And sometimes, those consequences aren't just theoretical. They rise up, take form, and tear their creators apart. Mobia isn't just a place of silent suffering. It's also a place of rebellion, vanishing acts, and the kind of betrayal that makes you question whether any of it was worth it to begin with. There are entire worlds within the domain that no longer respond to Vox hails, not because they were destroyed by an outside force, but because something went wrong from within. One of the most infamous examples is Farron's Fall, a planet that served as a behavioral control hub. It was meant to be the perfect pacified society, everyone implanted with neural governors, every action monitored, every emotion chemically regulated. On paper, it was a success. The populace operated with clockwork efficiency for nearly 30 years. But then the broadcasts stopped. Recovery teams found the cities empty, the infrastructure intact, but no bodies. Just silence. No signs of violence, no evidence of war. The entire population had simply vanished. Some think they fled into the underhives. Others believe they achieved some kind of hive mind transcendence. A darker theory suggests the experiment triggered a mass psychic event that wiped the population from reality altogether. Then there are the rebellions. You'd think the Mobian domain, with its indoctrinated soldiers and programmed citizens, would be resistant to revolt. But control is a fragile illusion, and in Mobia, it's constantly being stretched to the breaking point. One of the bloodiest examples was the uprising on Triskelion 4, a penal world used for stress testing atmospheric terraforming systems. For decades, the prisoners endured volatile climate shifts, failing infrastructure, and sporadic bombardments from orbital labs testing weather control satellites. Until one day, they didn't. Using stolen tech and jury-rigged weapons, they overran the main research stations in under 72 hours. The Mechanicus responded with a virus bombing campaign, but not before the rebels broadcast damning footage of the experiments to nearby systems. Of course, the transmissions were intercepted and suppressed, but the incident left a mark. Triskelion 4 is now listed as non-viable, but rumors say survivors still hold the planet's equator, building their own empire from the wreckage. There are also betrayals, the kind that come from inside the machine. Tech priests who've gone rogue, inquisitorial cells that switch objectives mid-mission, entire regiments that, after too many neural tweaks or chemical augmentations, simply reject their orders. The Mobian domain is littered with these fractures. One particularly chilling case involves the Ninth Forged, an elite mechanized unit developed to test cognitive reflex implants. For a time, they were a triumph. Faster, smarter, more lethal than anything fielded before. But they started asking questions, philosophical ones, about identity, death, and purpose. When their handlers tried to reset their memories, the unit revolted, not with rage, but with cold, clinical precision. They erased the lab staff, shut down the facility's power grid, and disappeared into the wastelands of their test world. No one has seen them since. Their designation has been purged from official records, but whispers of their emblem, a cracked cog over a human eye, still surface in fringe military reports. Of course, not every breakdown ends in horror. There are rare cases where something good came from the chaos, brief, flickering moments of triumph that feel almost miraculous. One such instance is the story of Mirabelle's Light, a small agri-colony that was subjected to forced psychic acceleration trials. It should have ended like all the others, in madness, mutation, or death. But instead, the community banded together. They found a way to shield one another from the worst effects of the warp conditioning, creating a network of empathy-based resistance. Their bonded dreams stabilized the local warp currents, and for almost 5 years, the colony operated in harmony, producing more food than any world in the sector. It didn't last. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica eventually declared the entire population unstable and launched a purification strike. But the fact it happened at all, that something beautiful managed to grow in Moebia, even for a moment, is something fans still talk about. What really gets under your skin is how little these failures are acknowledged. You won't find memorials. You won't hear confessions. The Imperium doesn't learn from these mistakes because officially they never happened. When a world vanishes, it's reclassified. When a rebellion succeeds, the maps are redrawn. When a miracle blooms, it's silenced before it can inspire others. Mobia is a living system of denial, where every consequence is buried beneath another layer of experimentation. Some theorists believe there's a pattern, that these failures aren't just accidents, but part of the design. That the Imperium wants to see what happens when things go wrong, to harvest the data from collapse as eagerly as from control. In that light, every rebellion becomes a simulation. Every vanishing act becomes a case study. It's a terrifying thought that even defiance, even tragedy has been weaponized in the name of research. And yet there's something deeply human about the failures of Moebia. Amid the horror, there's rebellion. Amid the programming, there's resistance. Amid the silence, there are screams. The people here, what's left of them, aren't just victims. They're stories, cautionary tales, proof that even in the most tightly controlled system, chaos finds a way to slip through the cracks. Sometimes the test subjects bite back, and in those moments, Mobia bleeds. Here's where things really start to spiral into the deep end. We've talked about the horrors, the experiments, the silent tragedies of the Mobian domain. But once you start pulling at the threads, you realize just how many of them don't lead to any official documentation. They vanish into dead channels, sealed archives, or worse, open up into vast, tangled webs of speculation. The deeper you dig, the more you realize that Mobia isn't just a testing ground for technology or biology. It might be hiding something much, much older and darker. One of the most persistent theories among lore obsessives is that the Mobian domain is being used to secretly research Xenos technology, willingly. Not just salvaging it after battles, which is already heresy in most parts of the Imperium, but actively experimenting with it. There are whispers of facilities where Eldar Wraithbone has been grafted into Imperial structures. Allegedly, there was even a project that tried to interface Necron inert constructs with Mechanicus logic engines. The goal? To create self-repairing cities that could rebuild themselves after bombardment. That's not even the shocking part. The shocking part is that it might have worked, just not how they wanted. One fan report references a forgotten world where the buildings began growing without command, changing layouts overnight, assimilating anyone who entered. Eventually, the world was declared lost to geological instability. No one talks about the Necron cores buried beneath it. And then there's chaos. You'd assume chaos would be an outside threat, a corruption that seeps in. But some theorists argue it's the other way around, that the Mobian domain isn't being invaded by chaos, it's being fed to it, slowly, deliberately. There's a school of thought that believes the Inquisition is using Mobia to study the long-term exposure of psychers to minor warp bleed, just to see how far they can stretch the mind before demonic incursion becomes inevitable. It's a horrifying idea, pushing souls to the breaking point, just to time how long it takes for a horror to come calling. One tale, often dismissed as apocryphal, speaks of a planet-wide ritual that was passed off as a mass psychological trial. Thousands of test subjects, unknowingly forming a warp-significant pattern just by living their lives in a state-controlled loop. The result was a spontaneous rip in reality, a controlled demonic incursion that was observed for 48 hours before the planet was subjected to exterminatus. All records of the event were lost in a data arch fire 2 years later. But the most provocative theory by far, the one that really divides the community, is the idea that the Mobian domain is connected to the genetic legacy of the Primarchs. Some believe Mobia isn't just a testing ground for ideas. It's a testing ground for blood. The theory goes that during the Great Crusade, samples of Primarch genetic material were hidden away, outside the main repositories. Not on Terra, not on Mars, but far-flung regions where no one would think to look. Over time, those samples became the foundation for gene manipulation projects, some meant to recreate lost legions, others meant to push past the limits of the Adeptus Astartes entirely. There's a haunting story about a place called Eshael's Forge. Allegedly, it was a lab complex orbiting a dead world, staffed entirely by post-human scientists, hybrid constructs with no names, just functions. The experiments carried out there focused on accelerating gene splicing beyond known limits. At one point, they supposedly succeeded in creating a subject with near Primarch resilience, psychic sensitivity, and regenerative capacity. But the subject began dreaming in Old High Gothic, a language no one had taught it. It drew maps of planets that didn't exist, spoke of brothers it had never met. When interrogators tried to isolate it, it smiled and said, "You buried me once. You won't do it again." The facility went dark soon after, and while the story is most likely fan fiction, no one's ever been able to disprove it. Another, even more unsettling possibility is that the domain is being used to test for genetic compatibility, not for space marine programs, but for something beyond, like finding candidates who can host ancient pre-imperial intelligences or relic AIs. There's talk of entire planets being seeded with subtle modifications, then observed over generations to see what kind of traits rise. What happens when you expose a population to warp-adjacent anomalies for 500 years? Do they adapt? Do they evolve? Do they become something new? There's even a small but growing faction of fans who believe Mobia isn't entirely in Imperial hands at all, that there's a splinter faction of the Mechanicus operating independently, perhaps even worshipping a divergent form of the Omnissiah, something more alien. Some of the tech recovered from failed expeditions into Mobia carries script that doesn't match known binary lexicons. It sings, some say. Others claim it causes dreams. There's no proof, of course, just whispers. But whispers are how all the best secrets start in the 41st millennium. All of this points to one chilling idea, that Mobia is a mask. What looks like madness might be method, that behind the experimental chaos, the planetary disappearances, and the moral decay, there is a plan. Not necessarily one authored by any single branch of the Imperium, but something older, something systemic. Some believe it's the Emperor's own contingency, testing humanity's limits in secret. Others say it's the Mechanicus trying to craft a post-human future where flesh is obsolete. And some just think it's a cancer no one can cut out anymore. What we do know is this. The official records don't tell the full story. There's too much missing, too many locked files, too many missions that never returned. Moebia is where the galaxy's unresolved questions go to ferment. It's a test site, yes, but also a hiding place. A place where the truth is too dangerous to surface. And maybe that's the scariest theory of all. Not that there's something monstrous hiding in Mobia, but that everyone already knows, and they're just too afraid to admit it. Today, when people speak of the Mobian domain, those who still dare, it's in hushed tones or fragmented references. Official maps still show it, of course, though the boundaries have grown hazy over the centuries, like someone deliberately let the ink smear. Administratum reports still reference it under vague designations, Sector 617, Experimental Zone Theta, or the ever-popular Restricted Theater. But if you actually try to trace which worlds are still active, which ones maintain contact, or even which ones still orbit their suns, the answers start to fall apart. The Mobian domain isn't dead, it's just something else now. Most of the known planets are either classified as ongoing experimental environments or have been rebranded entirely. Some are ruled by governors who haven't been seen in decades. Others don't seem to have any governing structure at all, just auto systems, defense grids, and a rotating schedule of Mechanicus expeditions. Every so often, a world is reported as cleared for reintegration, but it never happens. The files go dark. Ships sent to investigate come back scrambled, missing crew, or speaking of atmospheric changes no one can explain. And still, The Imperium allows it to exist. Still, supplies trickle in. Still, something inside Mobia keeps the lights on. There are rumors of progress, though. Whispers of reclamation efforts being mounted by certain branches of the ecclesiarchy, backed by radical elements within the Inquisition. The idea is to purify the stain, to reclaim Mobia world by world. Some crusade fleets have allegedly pushed into the outer edges, bringing with them shrines, regimental chaplains, even sisters of battle. One such fleet, the Cleansing Flame, made it almost 5 systems in before vanishing. No distress signals, no debris fields, just silence. What followed were months of conflicting reports, some saying the fleet was destroyed, others insisting it had made landfall and gone rogue. A few even claim the Cleansing Flame now guards something inside Mobia, their faith repurposed into zealotry for a new cause. But again, nothing confirmed, only static and suggestion. You'd expect the domain to collapse under its own weight by now. A region can only endure so many failed experiments, failed regimes, failed moral tests before it burns out. But Mobia endures. It mutates, adapts, sheds skin, and grows new flesh. Some fans even say the domain is sentient, not metaphorically, but literally. That some intelligence birthed from centuries of data feeds, psychic exposure, and technological overreach now guides the region's development. It doesn't just contain experiments, it is the experiment, a living meta-organism testing humanity's boundaries. It's a wild theory, but when you see how neatly some disasters fold into new projects, how often chaos leads to results, you start to wonder if the domain really is following some deeper logic, just not one written by human hands. But is there hope for Moebia? That's the question that always pulls at you, even after all the horror. Some say yes, in a strange and distant way, that buried beneath the corruption and madness, there are still people, survivors, whole generations raised under shifting skies and constant surveillance who have never known anything else, but still endure. There are legends of self-liberated cities, underground movements, rogue preachers who teach not just the Emperor's word, but the idea that freedom is sacred. They scavenge forgotten tech, form their own militias, and even send encrypted messages out into the void, begging for help, or simply announcing that they still exist. And that alone means something. That defiance still burns, even in the darkest pit. There's a planet, Cultrus, I think, where it's said that the local population has completely rejected both Mechanicus influence and Imperial creed, not in the name of heresy, but survival. They've built a functional society out of cast-off tech and refused further visits. They shoot down survey ships and jam long-range Vox. They live without direction, without permission, and they are thriving. Some call them renegades, others the last free humans in Moebia. But maybe they're both. Maybe they're what Moebia always needed, not saviors, not purifiers, just people who stop playing the game. Of course, for every Cultrus, there's a dozen dead worlds. Mobia is still scarred beyond reason. Psychic bleed leaks into the void like a wound that won't heal. Some of its suns are visibly dimmer, surrounded by corona flares that scream in the minds of passing astropaths. There are space stations drifting in perfect silence, still functioning, but empty, like their crews vanished mid-sentence. The gravity wells of some moons behave erratically, as if warped by forces that don't obey physics anymore. This isn't a place that can be easily cleaned up. It would take generations of effort, trillions of thrones, and the willpower of gods to even begin restoring Moebia. And the truth is, no one really wants to. The Imperium has other concerns, greater threats. The Indomitus Crusade burns across the galaxy. Hive fleets descend. Chaos rises. Moebia, for all its grotesque uniqueness, is a low priority, a quiet scar, and so it remains. Not out of strategy, but apathy. A dark, festering corner of humanity's empire, left to its own devices because no one wants to deal with the mess. But I think that's what makes it fascinating. Because even as the Imperium ignores it, even as the Mechanicus keeps building, As the Inquisition keeps watching and the domain keeps shifting, there's still a heartbeat in there. Something alive, something stubborn, something human. And maybe, just maybe, that's the beginning of something new, or the last gasp of something old. Either way, Mobia isn't done yet. It never really was. You know, even after digging through all the horror, the twisted science, the silent rebellions, there's still something about the Mobian domain that refuses to let go. It lingers. It creeps into your thoughts, like a whisper behind a sealed door, always there, just out of reach. I think part of it is because it challenges the way we think about the Imperium itself. We're used to black and white narratives, heroes in gold, villains in shadow. But Mobia? It's something else entirely. A slow rot dressed as progress. A machine that forgot why it was built, but just kept running anyway. And honestly, that's the scariest part. The idea that the Imperium, in all its might and glory, might not be evil out of malice, but out of apathy, out of habit. You look at Mobia, and you don't see the classic enemies of mankind. No heretic uprisings led by frothing zealots. No demonic hordes boiling up from the warp. No tyrannid hive fleets blotting out the stars. Just silence. A grinding, procedural silence where the screams have been factored into the margin of error. That's a different kind of horror. One that doesn't burn worlds but forgets them. One that doesn't kill you with a bolt round but repurposes you into something less than human, something useful. I've seen people try to justify it. The ends justify the means. Humanity must survive at any cost. You know the lines. The same tired logic that's been used to excuse every atrocity from the Horus heresy to the Day of Revelation. But the thing about Mobia is that it doesn't give you a clean outcome. There's no victory at the end of it. No new super soldier saving the day. No shining beacon of technology rising from the ash. All you get is more ash, more silence, more empty facilities filled with failed prototypes and data that no one reads. If this is the price of progress, then what are we even buying? And still, I can't look away. Because there's something deeply compelling about the people who live in Mobia. Not the ones in charge, the Magi and the Inquisitors and the faceless technocrats. I'm talking about the survivors. The factory workers on planets that haven't seen daylight in generations. The children raised by servitor nurses who speak in binary. The soldiers who know they're just part of a field test and still stand their ground anyway. These people aren't just victims. They're the heart of this nightmare. The reason we should care. Because despite everything, they keep going. There's one story. I don't even know if it's true. But it's always stuck with me. A tech adept named Halvan, stationed on one of Mobia's lesser-known forge moons. Supposedly, he discovered a piece of tech so advanced, so revolutionary, that it could have changed the way the Imperium produces energy. Not warp-based, not plasma, something entirely different, clean, sustainable, and most importantly, replicable. But when he tried to submit it for review, the data vanished. His colleagues began forgetting his name. Eventually, he was reassigned to a maintenance post on an orbital sewage processor. His last Vox message ended with the words, "I saw the future. They flushed it." Whether that's true or not, it feels true. It feels exactly like something that would happen in Mobia. And maybe that's what makes the domain such a powerful symbol for fans like us. It's not just the monsters or the machines or the madness. It's the potential, the wasted potential. Every experiment that went too far. Every test that ignored the soul for the sake of results. It's a reminder that the Imperium's greatest threat might not be chaos or Xenos or even internal decay. It might be the simple refusal to stop, to look around, and to ask, why are we doing this? There's a phrase I read once in a data forum buried in the comment thread of a Mobia discussion. The domain is what happens when no one says no. That hit me. Because you think about how many layers of bureaucracy, how many overlapping authorities it takes for something like this to happen, and how easy it is for everyone to think, someone else is in charge. In Mobia, no one's in charge, and that's the point. It's a slow, grinding momentum that chews through planets and lives and just keeps going, because no one ever put a stop to it, because no one was allowed to. So maybe that's our job. Maybe the reason we tell these stories, dig into these reports, trace these rumors, isn't just for entertainment or theory crafting. Maybe it's to remember, to make sure these places aren't forgotten, to bear witness, even if the only thing we can do is talk about it, share it, pass it on. Because in the grim darkness of the far future, memory might be the last form of resistance we have left. And if you're still here, still listening, still wondering what else is out there, thank you. You're part of that resistance now. Stay curious, stay defiant, and whatever you do, never stop asking questions. Looking back at everything we've just gone through, I can't help but feel like the Mobian domain is less a place and more a mirror. A reflection of what the Imperium becomes when you strip away the banners, the sermons, the rigid hierarchy, and just let its instincts run wild. It's raw. It's honest in the most terrifying way. There's no pretending here, no illusions of nobility or purpose, just cold, relentless survival masquerading as innovation. It's the Imperium without its mask, and what we see underneath isn't something anyone should be proud of. And yet, that's what makes Mobia so important, because it forces us to ask questions the Imperium is too afraid to answer. What happens when loyalty is manufactured instead of earned? When soldiers are grown instead of raised? When technology becomes not a tool, but a master? We always talk about the Emperor's vision for humanity. But would he have accepted what Mobia has become? Or would he have seen it as the inevitable outcome of an empire that worships stability over soul? There's this one fan theory I keep circling back to. It suggests that the Mobian domain is a kind of prophecy. Not in the mystical sense, but in the practical one. That it shows us the path the Imperium is already walking, whether we want to admit it or not. An empire too large to control, too fragmented to reform, too desperate to care. In that light, Moebia isn't an aberration. It's a preview, a testing ground not just for machines and men, but for the fate of humanity itself. If we can't stop what's happening there, if we can't even understand it, then how are we supposed to fight the darkness beyond? And that's what hits hardest. Because while we laugh at the absurdity, gasp at the horror, and speculate about the mysteries, real people are still living in that place, or surviving in it, or being consumed by it. Call them test subjects, heretics, rogue governors, whatever you want. At the end of the day, they're just humans. Some of them probably still believe in the Emperor. Some probably don't even know his name. But all of them are trapped in a part of the Imperium where being forgotten is the only guarantee. I don't know if Mobia can be saved. I don't even know if it should be. Maybe there are places so far gone that redemption just isn't an option anymore. But I do think we should remember it. Not because it's some lost paradise or because it holds forbidden power, but because it's a warning carved into the stars. A reminder of what happens when progress replaces people, when secrecy outweighs empathy, when the means stop needing a reason, and the end is whatever survives. In a galaxy of endless war, Mobia stands out, not because it's the most violent, but because it dares to be subtle, because its horrors don't roar. They whisper. They embed themselves in protocols, in project codes, in the margins of reports no one reads. That's what makes it scarier than any demon or alien menace. You can't fight what you don't see. You can't cleanse what isn't even acknowledged. And in the end, maybe that's the real power of the domain. It endures because no one wants to admit it exists in the first place. So yeah, I've spent a lot of time trying to piece together the puzzle of Moebia, not because I think I'll solve it, but because I have to understand it. Because deep down, I think we all know that Mobia isn't unique. It's just the one we noticed. There could be more like it, dozens, hundreds, maybe whole sectors rotting in silence while the Imperium marches onward, never looking back. But if we do look back, if we dare to really see what's happening there, then maybe we can stop it from spreading. Maybe we can find the line again, that fragile boundary between strength and savagery. Maybe we can remind ourselves what it means to be human in a galaxy that keeps trying to forget. And if this kind of exploration resonates with you, if you want to keep digging into the dark corners of the Imperium and uncover the stories no one else wants to tell, then you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button, leave a comment with your theories or thoughts, and share this with someone who's ready to see the Imperium through a different lens. Because this universe is vast, brutal, and full of secrets, and we've only just begun to pull back the curtain. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the most terrifying truths are the ones that were never meant to be found.